Happy Tuesday. Welcome to the briefing room, coming to you from the Washington Bureau of ABC News. I'm John Santucci, and we are going to spend a lot of our show today abroad, something a little different for the briefing room, but there is so much news happening overseas, starting with what's going on in Hong Kong right now. Airports closed, people not able to get on their flights, and just the growing tensions between protesters that have been happening on the ground for weeks and weeks and weeks. You see some of the footage from our cameras that have been over there, mostly overnight, over in Hong Kong right now, as the airport has been shut down for several hours. Let's go to ABC's Julia McFarlane, who's been watching this with us from our London bureau. Julia, right now it seems like still overnight in Hong Kong, the airport's still closed, but protesters not backing down.
Hey, John. Yeah, exactly. It's currently the middle of the night in Hong Kong. This is the fifth day that we have seen protesters gathered at the terminals at the airport as part of their protest against police brutality and against Chinese influence in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong government. What's happened today, after Monday's unprecedented cancellation of all flights in Hong Kong International Airport, don't forget, one of the busiest international airports in the world, more flights were cancelled today as unrest continued. Just after 11 o'clock in the evening, local time, police moved in to try and clear the protesters. Riot police armed with batons, with truncheons, and some reported pepper gas, pepper spray and tear gas to move protesters out of the way, and some very ugly, violent scenes of confrontation as well. There was a man who was tussled up by the crowd, the protesters who suspected him of being an undercover police officer. He actually ended up being a Chinese journalist working for a Chinese state-run newspaper. He's now receiving treatment in the hospital. Some really worrying scenes there, but it looks like things have not entirely died down. Everyone's waiting to see if this will continue for a sixth day in the airport.
Yeah, the images are just striking. Julia, stay with me. I do want to bring in Dolly Yang. He's a professor over at the University of Chicago. He's been monitoring the situation, an expert on Hong Kong. Professor, thanks so much for taking the time this Tuesday afternoon to speak with us. We appreciate it. And this all started, sir, because of unrest with Carrie Lam. She is the chief executive of Hong Kong, and amendments she wanted to make to the extradition bill.
Actually, to be signed, to be about the mainland of China, so that Hong Kong residents could be extradited to the mainland. And there is a lot of suspicion and distrust of the mainland judicial authorities in Hong Kong. So that provoked a lot of unrest and anger, especially among the young, especially because she tried to push the bill through the legislature in a very short time.
And just explain this to me if you can, because obviously different countries, different political systems. The chief executive position, Carrie Lam, she's been asked to resign by these protesters. She's rebuffed those requests. She is remaining on the job. But what do protesters here want to see? Because if she was to go, which doesn't seem like it's going to happen, they're calling for open elections.
Oh, yes, indeed. So she is deeply unpopular. If there is a popular vote today, she would certainly be voted out. Currently, Hong Kong has a system granted by the central government of China to allow it to install its leaders through a limited vote, through the especially essentially a special council. And usually the candidate supported by the central government can win that particular electoral process. So the public actually has been very unhappy with this system. Under the basic law, there is some promise that there should be broadly a popular vote directly by the people. So after the withdrawal, essentially, of the extradition bill, in fact, the public actually began to demand more. They don't simply want the stopping of that process into the extradition bill, but they want actually to expand the democratic process. They want a direct vote for the chief executive position.
And Professor, lastly, as I mentioned, you are an expert on Hong Kong. You have followed their politics for years. What do you believe now is the impetus for this sort of outrage? As Julia just said, you've now seen the airport there closed for day 5, potentially, as we're in the overnight hours right now, could be going in to day 6. What do you believe was the driving force behind these protests? And frankly, the way, just looking at the footage that we're showing right now on screen, the way they're just growing and growing and frankly, successfully shutting down an airport.
Yeah, well, I think actually in a more open process, Carrie Lam, who has already offered to resign to the central authorities, would have resigned, would have actually mitigated a lot of the public anger. Instead, the center has backed her up, has backed up the Hong Kong police. So as a result, the authorities are dug in confronting and cracking down on the protesters. On the other hand, actually, the protesters, they have been galvanizing public opinion. There has been escalation of demands on both sides as a result. This confrontation has headed to the airport and leading to the stoppage of flights and so on. So what we see, therefore, is really an intensification of the confrontation between the two sides.
Professor, thank you so much for your expertise on this. We do appreciate it. I want to go back over to Julia before we wrap up on this part, because Julia, as you mentioned, could be going into day 6 with the airport being affected. What are we hearing from the airline carriers right now?
Well, there are still a handful of planes arriving into Hong Kong even as we speak. A couple of long-haul airlines. Qantas was one I saw that was just due to land just as we were coming into air. A few others. There were still cancellations, but I think they're going to reassess to see what the situation is in the morning. As you say, there are protesters still at the terminal. But another thing I think we should point out is something else we've seen for the second day running is that just across over in the mainland, in Shenzhen, South Guangdong province, we've seen huge display of military hardware from the Chinese. Now, they say this is part of a military drill and exercise that they're carrying out. But of course, experts and monitors and analysts over in Hong Kong, they say this is psychological warfare. This is basically the Chinese sort of muscling up to try and get protesters to stay indoors.
Going to keep an eye on this. Julia McFarlane in London, thank you. And Professor Yang, thank you as well. Back here at home, President Trump on his vacation in Bedminster, New Jersey, getting ready for a trip today. He's heading out to Pennsylvania. Was asked about these protests, asked about the videos we just showed you. Take a listen to what the president said earlier today.
I hope it works out for everybody, including China. I hope it works out peacefully. Hope nobody gets hurt. I hope nobody gets killed.
So what is the U.S. doing on this? Let's bring in ABC's Connor Finnegan and ABC's Rachel Scott. Connor is over at the State Department. Rachel in Bedminster traveling with the president. Connor, let's start with you. What are we hearing from the Department of State right now?
Well, John, the Department of State is doubling down on their support for Hong Kong's protests and their support for the movement, really. Again, a spokesperson telling me today that they remain staunchly supportive of these people's right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. That contrasts a bit with what we had heard from President Trump. President Trump today issuing some support for the protesters, but saying that he hopes this all works out for everyone, including China. And so what we heard from him later, though, was a tweet that seemed to threaten that there is a red line for the United States here. He tweeted that intelligence has informed us that the Chinese government is moving troops to the border with Hong Kong, as Julia just mentioned, and he warned everyone should be calm and safe. It's unclear what the United States red line is and whether or not the use of Chinese military across the border into Hong Kong would trigger that. We've heard from U.S. lawmakers that would be a step too far. Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi both warning Chinese authorities not to take such action.
And Rachel Scott, let's bring you in on this conversation because, as Connor just said, the president spoke about it, tweeted about it. We know he's been monitoring the situation. What are we hearing right now from officials? Because there's been a weird week right now so far with the president in China. We're going to talk about tariffs in our next segment. But as Connor points out, we haven't seen him really engage on the situation in Hong Kong prior to today like he did.
Yeah, that's right, John. And it's interesting hearing Connor talk about the response from the State Department, because the president's response has been more measured, right? I mean, he's not exactly pointing the blame here, even earlier tweeting that some people are blaming him. But a very measured response we saw from the president, who described that situation as tough and tricky, again saying he hopes it works out for everyone. And when you compare that to the State Department or even leaders within his own party, Mitch McConnell tweeted yesterday any violent crackdown would be completely unacceptable. That's what people in his own party are saying. It's worth noting that the president's response is a little bit more measured and a softer approach, especially as the United States continues these talks with China, right? We have trade discussions that are ongoing. There is an escalating trade war that is happening. And so we don't know if that is reflective in the president's comments, but certainly something to keep in mind, John.
Absolutely, and we're going to be watching this. We have all the latest reporting right now online at abcnews.com on this, and much more tonight on World News Tonight with David Muir. Connor, we're going to let you go. Rachel, don't move, because we're going to stay on China and tariffs. We've been watching what is happening right now with the stock market. Stocks surging when the president announced that he'd be delaying his tariffs on the Chinese goods. Let's bring in ABC's chief business and economics correspondent, Rebecca Jarvis, who's been monitoring this one with us. Rebecca, stocks instantly reacting to this news from the president.
Well, and stocks, John, have been responding very heavily to all conversations around trade and tariffs. And what we saw earlier this week and last week, frankly, were the sell-off in the markets around the idea that these tariffs would be hitting next month, the 10% tariff on $300 billion worth of goods. Today, President Trump announced that those tariffs that were set to take place in September will now be delayed until December 15th. And in some cases, the tariffs won't even take effect. And the thinking here goes that there were a lot of companies, like, for example, Apple, that bring their products into the United States, that if the tariffs were to take effect in September, it would increase the price of products just as consumers were heading to the mall for the holiday retail season. That would be a big impact potentially for retailers, for companies like Apple, which is why, by the way, Apple's stock today is up 5% on a relief rally in light of this news. And we know that these tariffs, to some degree, are very likely going to be passed to consumers. And so a lot of retailers were rattling the table saying, you can't hit me with this right before the most important selling season for our company.
And the president spoke a little earlier about this, saying just there that he was delaying this because of the Christmas and holiday season. Let's take a listen to what he said earlier today.
We're doing this for Christmas season, just in case some of the tariffs would have an impact on U.S. customers, which so far they've had virtually none. The only impact has been that we've collected almost $60 billion from China, compliments of China. But just in case they might have an impact on people, what we've done is we've delayed it so that they won't be relevant for the Christmas shopping season.
Rebecca, do we get a sense that the White House heard from any of these CEOs from these big companies? I mean, they've had a great relationship with Apple's Tim Cook over the years. He's had good communications and dialogue with Ivanka Trump and the president directly. Do we think that any of them may have actually touched base with the president directly or with any of his advisors as the deadline was approaching for these tariffs?
Every single CEO is reaching out to some degree, whether it's them by directly or members of their team are reaching out directly to the White House, talking to the White House about the impact that these tariffs will have on their business. Look, when you think about planning a business, and I talk to executives all the time in corporate America, they're saying over and over again that they're struggling to figure out business going forward because they don't know what the playing field is going to look like going forward. They can't anticipate what their costs are going to be going forward as far as these tariffs are concerned. At the same time, most of corporate America believes right now that something does need to be done in order to even the playing field with China. 1 in 5 U.S. companies have had their IP stolen by China. There are major issues with cyber espionage with China. And the majority of companies that are multinational, that are based here in the U.S., that are doing business with China are facing these issues. They would like to see a more fair playing field, but at the same time, tariffs are going to cost them something, and they're very likely going to cost their customers something. And that's for companies a hard pill to swallow, because when Wall Street watches all of this take place, Wall Street knows that when a company charges its customers more, the customers oftentimes retreat. They're less interested in buying the products, and that hits the bottom line.
And Rachel Scott, we know that this president has campaigned aggressively on the economy. He has said that unemployment is down, more and more Americans are finding jobs, the economy is doing well, the stock market, as we just mentioned, doing well. But nevertheless, he has been saying we need to check China. This does appear like he is backing down, maybe heard from Wall Street. Are they nervous that the president sort of looks like he, gave up here on trying to punish China, as he had been saying for so long?
Yeah, well, John, in an escalating trade war, right, this is a little bit of a retreat. It's a tactical delay, essentially. But again, it is a delay. It's just temporary relief. As Rebecca said, those tariffs would be coming back in December, closer to the holiday season, December 15th. But again, this is a game that has been described of who can blink first, right? I mean, you had the president impose that tariff threat initially, imposing 10% on the $300 billion of Chinese imports. Laptops, MacBooks, all would have a higher price tag, right? But then you had China respond and drop their currency level, and then you saw the stocks fall. You saw Wall Street have one of its worst days, and then all of a sudden now you see the president kind of backing away from that again, saying, "Listen, we're going to wait," kind of gives some relief for the holiday season. Stocks going back up. All of this, though, farmers caught in the middle. The White House offering assistance. It has been a back and forth ordeal for some time now, and we don't know if we're getting any closer. We do know that the U.S. and Chinese officials did speak today. President Trump called those talks productive, but are we any closer to a deal? We don't know. If the two sides can't get on the same page, this may be continuing, John.
And Rebecca Jarvis, this honestly is a true fact here, Rebecca. Every time we see you on World News down here in the stock market, there's a little group of us that say, should we look at our 401k today? Should we do it? Should we look today?
It's a rare day. It's a rare day where you see me and the market is up. So the market is up today. Look, if you look at the market at this point right now, the S&P 500 is still only about 5% below its record highs. So if you think about how this year has been so far, it's been pretty good. These last couple of days, there's been a lot more volatility. I will say that most of Wall Street's read, the majority of hedge fund managers that are looking at the geopolitical climate and what's taking place right now around tariffs, they read this as the U.S. has blinked. And there's a connection to some degree, at least in some economists and analysts' mind, between what we're seeing play out in Hong Kong and what we're seeing play out here with tariffs. The idea being China's resolve, that China is resolved to stay at the table and to fight this and stay the course. And China doesn't have an election coming up in 2020. The United States does. And that is a real question, because if you think about these tariffs and you think about what the consequence may very well be, could be for your 401k, John, but also for consumer prices, while a lot of businesses, like I said, believe that something should be done, there's also that reality check of if the economy is in a pretty solid place today and it's not in 7 months, how damaging is that going to be for this administration?
And you better believe the Trump campaign is watching that as
Absolutely.
well. Rebecca Jarvis in New York. Thank you, Rebecca. We're going to go back overseas again. I told you, a lot of international news today. What's going on in Russia? This is a really weird story. So this is an explosion at a nuclear testing site. We're still trying to understand what happened. Apparently, it has caused some casualties. It's somewhat under control, but that's why we sent ABC's James Longman over there, and he's trying to get to the bottom of this. So, James, what exactly happened? Because I'm a little confused, because every story you read, it's not really clear what they were doing, the government's involved, not involved. Help us.
Yeah, you're right, John. I mean, Russia, right? I mean, it's never really that clear. And before I got here, by the way, I was just making sure that there wasn't a massive nuclear catastrophe, because I don't mind danger I can see, right? Protests, give me war, give me bullets, but, nuclear waste, I don't want to deal with that. So the first thing to say is there hasn't been a massive Chernobyl-type explosion in the north of Russia. I think when I read some of these headlines, I was thinking, boy, this does not look good. Basically, what's happened, there's been an explosion. It's about 600 miles north of where I am now at a missile testing facility, a nuclear missile testing facility. For a few days, the Russians didn't really want to talk about it. There was kind of a blackout for 4 or 5 days, and I think that's where the interest came. An explosion at a missile testing center, Russians not talking about it, there's been radiation detected, and then news suddenly, kind of trickled out, and we've now understood, the Russian authorities have said, that there has been radiation detected, between 4 to 16 times the normal amount of radiation. So again, that is a terrifying thing to hear if you don't know anything about, and let's be honest, this is nuclear science, rocket science. I mean, I'm not a rocket scientist.
I was going to say, we're journalists, James. We don't do that.
Yeah. Exactly. So Chernobyl, to give you some idea, was many thousands of times the kind of normal radiation that you should be exposed to, and that is why it caused such a devastating catastrophe. Here, 4 to 16 times, still serious, but not devastating. But I think the reason why there's interest is because Russia has been very reluctant to really kind of be open about what has happened. And I think also there's interest in what exactly it is that they're doing in this place. And I think there is some suggestion that they're testing some pretty serious nuclear hardware, including something called Skyfall, which sounds, again, pretty kind of blockbuster, but it's basically a missile powered by nuclear-powered missile. NATO, by the way, calls it Skyfall, which is being developed in this place. So there's a lot of secrecy about it. Basically, it seems that the situation is under control. But I should say that I've just come from a meeting with a Greenpeace activist who's made us aware of something which I think is actually a little bit more interesting, which is that most of the readings that we're getting come from a town about 30 miles south of the place where this happened. There are no readings coming from a town much, much closer. And I'm going to take my notes here because I'm not a Russian speaker. It's called Nyoska. And we understand there's probably about 1,000 to 2,000 people in that place. There haven't been readings coming from this particular town. And there was an announcement today that this town was actually being evacuated. And then there was another announcement that the Russians had decided, in fact, not to evacuate this place. Either way, there's a lot of mystery still surrounding this. I am fascinated by it, and so I'm going to be here keeping my eyes on what's going up in the north of Russia right about now.
Well, I hope you don't see anything in some way, James, because that's why we ensure your safety over there as you try to figure out. James Longman over in Russia on the case for us. Thank you, sir. Coming back to the United States, everyone is still focused on what is happening with Jeffrey Epstein. We obviously know he died by suicide over the weekend, but now what happens to his victims? What happens to this investigation? We learned just a few hours ago that the warden of the prison where he was being held has been replaced. Attorney General William Barr putting an acting warden there. Let's bring in ABC's Aaron Katersky, who I don't think has stopped working since this weekend as we've been trying to figure it out. So Aaron, bring us up to speed. It feels like every second we're seeing an email from you with a new headline. What do we know at this moment on the investigation?
I think the latest, John, involves, as you say, the warden now being reassigned into a headquarters position, a warden from FCI in Otisville, oddly where Michael Cohen is incarcerated at the moment, is going to be coming down to New York City to be the acting warden at MCC Manhattan. And that's just one change that Attorney General Barr made. 2 MCC staff members who were on duty in Epstein's unit, the special housing unit, have also been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigations. They were supposed to be checking on Jeffrey Epstein every 30 minutes in the hours leading to his death, but that protocol, for some reason, was not followed, John.
And the president, Aaron, is not resisting any opportunity to comment on this case. He was asked about it today. Take a listen.
He was on his plane 27 times, and he said he was on the plane 4 times. But when they checked the plane log, Bill Clinton, who is a very good friend of Epstein, he was on the plane about 27 or 28 times. So why did he say 4 times? And then the question you have to ask is, did Bill Clinton go to the island? Because Epstein had an island that was not a good place, as I understand it, and I was never there. So you have to ask, did Bill Clinton go to the island? That's the question. If you find that out, you're going to know a lot.
Okay, so that's President Trump talking about former President Bill Clinton. Before we even dive into it, let's put up the statement from Bill Clinton's office that was issued right after everything with Epstein. It reads in part, he had one meeting with Epstein in his Harlem office in 2002 and around the same time made one brief visit to Epstein's New York apartment with a staff member and a security detail. He has not spoken to Epstein in well over a decade and has never been to Little St. James Island, Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, or his residence in Florida. That is a statement from Bill Clinton's office. Aaron, fact check us. Where are we on this?
Well, we can only go by the former president's statement, right, that he had never been to Little St. James, Jeffrey Epstein's U.S. Virgin Islands compound, where a number of his high-profile friends had supposedly visited Epstein. You know who was there, though, as you can see on your screen? Agents from the FBI and detectives from the NYPD, because just yesterday they raided the place, and we were told they were looking for evidence of others in Jeffrey Epstein's inner circle. Someone like Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite who was alleged to have been Epstein's madam, and perhaps others who victims have said enabled Epstein's sex trafficking. And we know that victims, now that Jeffrey Epstein can build a case against some of those connected to Jeffrey Epstein who may have been involved in the alleged sex trafficking.
Yeah, hard to remember, right, as the president is resurfacing these comments and these, frankly, just conspiracy theories to his millions of followers. The president, again, he called for a full investigation of the matter, but he did not back down. He, in fact, defended the fact that he's retweeting and surfacing these claims. He thinks it should be looked into, John.
ABC's Rachel Scott out in Bedminster, New Jersey with the president. We're going to have all the latest on all of these stories coming up on ABC's World News tonight. And of course, you can catch the latest anytime at abcnews.com. For the Briefing Room, I'm John Santucci in Washington. You're watching ABC News.